This reel, prepared by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for the Bell and Howell Company, contains samples of voice and music, selected to serve test material to check the operation of equipment.
Piano compositions, Windy, Sycamore Tree, and Tone Poem.
My grandmother's uncle took care of my grandmother from the time of her parents' death till the time she was married. As the account brings out, the uncle was mayor of a small town called Borisov, which is near the city of Minsk in Russia. The story is how he would have told it a few years after my grandmother's marriage. The time is about the middle of the 18th century. Yes, I know Anne very well. In fact, I took care of her for about 10 years. Her father, my brother, had been killed in an accident when she was 6 months old, and her mother had died in another accident about 1 year later. As I was the nearest relative, I took care of her. I was then also mayor of this town of Borisov, which is where we lived. I sent her to school here, where she learned to read and write. When she was about 12 years old, I decided it was time she was getting married. After looking around, I made arrangements with the uncle of a suitable lad for a marriage between my niece and his nephew. This lad's parents had died a few years previously and had left him a large farm about 5 miles from town, so I had no reason for worrying about my niece's future. Several days after the arrangements had been made, I called in my niece from her play outdoors, had my servants dress her up, and introduced her to her new husband, Norman Mazo. The wedding ceremony was then enacted, and she left my house to go to her new home. As far as I know, she is very happy in her new surroundings. Mr. Mazo had a maid helping Mrs. Mazo. She came several years after the marriage and remained in the household long after Mrs. Mazo's death. This is how the maid would have told the story about 8 years after Mrs. Mazo's death. The summers with the peasants working away in the fields. There were 50 of them, each with his separate agreement with Mr. Mazo. Mr. Mazo furnished the land and seeds, the peasants farmed the land, and gave half of what they grew to him. Mr. Mazo, however, did just as much work as the peasants on his own particular soil. He liked very much to work around the growing plants. Mrs. Mazo liked also to work in the garden. I can see her now with her long dark hair and jovial smile. She was a little plump, but what did that matter to her? She was always busy. In the morning, she would go to town to do the shopping. In the afternoon, she could be found in the kitchen or in the garden working. And in the evening, she would sit by the fireplace sewing. Yes, how often do I now picture her in this latter position, happily sewing away. She was not always happy, though. It was hard for her to lose her first daughter after having borne 6 sons safely. And how could a mother feel after losing 2 of her sons by sickness? And so, hardly noticed, the years passed away. It was hardly realized that the oldest son was nearing the age of 27. But there was a change coming over Mrs. Mazo. She was not too well. The doctor advised a new climate. Mr. Mazo was quick to consent, as he was devoted to his wife. He left the farm in charge of his sons and took Mrs. Mazo with him to visit the United States. I heard that they rented a farm in the mountains of New York. It was while they were there that Mrs. Mazo had her last child, a daughter. I believe they would have stayed in the United States had it not been for the oldest son's marriage. This, however, they wanted to witness, and so they returned. And how different was Mrs. Mazo. The 10-month vacation completely cured her of her illness, and once again she was completely healthy. After the son's marriage, the Mazos settled down to the old happy routine. The next 7 years were spent in much the same way as the years previous to their trip to the United States. Then, on one of Mrs. Mazo's daily trips to the town for supplies, the tragic accident occurred. Mrs. Mazo's 3rd son, who was about 25 years old, was working as a woodsman at the time. There were several men, however, who were jealous of his position as foreman of their group, and they were seeking to harm him. As Mrs. Mazo's son was riding the buggy to town on this trip, these enemies of his told him to stop. Then they started an argument with him. Mrs. Mazo was trying to get her son to continue to town when one of her son's enemies picked up a club and hit him on the head. A corner of this club pierced Mrs. Mazo's brain. She was taken back to the farm where she died a couple of hours later. A tragic ending to such a full life. Her son lingered on a week and then died of his injuries. Mr. Mazo was hurt deeply by his wife's death, and yet he continued and is still continuing to carry on the farm. Even now, his youngest daughter, just turning 15, is planning to leave for the United States. It is too bad she cannot remember, as I do, the beautiful picture of her mother sitting by the fire and happily sewing away. Time is but a flowing thing. The past is but a muddled dream. The present is continually becoming the past, and the future is but guesswork, at which the past can but give hints. I would judge it impossible for one to go himself into the past or future, or even to look into the future for that matter, because that would destroy the flowing, and there would be no time. At present, I remember some of the muddled dreams of the past and will put them in writing before even those are gone. I am told, and my birth certificate says, that I was born on February 20th, 1922. I am also told that when I was a baby I had many falls, but for this I cannot vouch. I do remember quite vividly, though, when I was 3 or 4 years old, I won my first prize in competition. It was a race between babies, and well do I recall running in the evening of the 4th of July, probably 1925, against other babies to victory and winning a bottle of pop. And then I ran to my mother, joyous and happy, showing her the prize. I was too young to have worries and must have been in a very happy state. If only it were possible for everyone to live forever at the moment they were most happy. This must have been about the time we had Peaches, a dog. He followed my mother and father home from a carnival or circus one night and stayed with us for some time. I remember seeing my sister Ida ride on his back. He had puppies one day which were eventually given away by father, who also gave away Peaches a little later. My father, short, red-faced, and hot-tempered, but yet there was something pitiful about him. I remember his running a candy truck. He broke up with my mother, with whom he had a great deal of trouble, and after this break he seemed to cause my mother as much trouble as possible for quite a few years. It seems to me one of these causes of the break was Herman. Herman was my stepbrother. He was tall, jovial, and likable, yet he had a hard time of it due to my father. He ran away several times. Once I remember his staying with some friends nearby. I also remember my father having a rage about this. At this stage of my life, Herman sold newspapers, and often I remember his coming in late with a newspaper under his hand. And there was a time which I dimly remember coming home from a show to see broken showcases, broken by my father in one of his rages at a time my mother was running a candy store. And there was a time on Thanksgiving, I think, that my father left in one of his rages because of some soup. I do not remember the exact complaint. I also remember living next to a saloon on Mayberry Ground. Often was the time we had to go in the lavatory next door. Most of this is in a dim haze, though. The haze starts clearing when we moved to 6310 14th, near Ferry Parks, in May of 1929. I left the Columbian School, to which I remember walking a great distance with my sister, and transferred to the Goldberg School to the 2nd grade. That was when we began to be troubled less and less with our father, although he was still causing a lot of trouble through the courts. I remember my mother at this time as very worried. For a few months before we got the full place on 14th and Ferry Parks, we were forced to live in a store in front and sleep on mattresses next to the floor. There were 8 of us, 3 sisters, a brother, a stepsister, a stepbrother, my mother, and myself at that time. We eventually got the house, though. It is at that store at that time, and also on Mayberry Ground, that we used to write all over the partition, "Suck a Finger May." It was also in that place and on Mayberry Ground that I remember taking baths in a washtub set on chairs. I remember quite vividly one night being locked out after playing. My mother thought I was in bed and had locked up the house. The lady running a store next door offered to put me up, but I was obstinate. Eventually, I woke up my mother and got in, though. It was in this house that I got the stitches put in over my right eye. It was in a youthful spirit that I buried a snake, really a worm, in the ground and put up a cross to mark the spot. Then in some manner we got hold of some tall, narrow boxes and of course got in one. Unable to walk, I fell right over the stick. If the accident had been an inch to the left, it would have killed me, or a half-inch lower blinded me in the right eye, so the doctor later said. When my mother saw me bleeding, she grabbed me up and rushed me to the doctor at a nearby hospital to be treated. I dimly remember a boy next door who had a large play airplane in which we played and had a lot of fun. It was here, too, that Alice and Jimmy lived with us for a while. Tall and full of fun was Alice, and quiet, but who could also make a lot of noise, was her son Jimmy. They attended Goldberg with us for a while. There was also the time that I went swimming for the first time in my life with Herman, Frank, a friend, and Arnold, a friend. I almost drowned when there, but was pulled to safety by Herman. Even at that time, Herman had had his leg amputated. I believe it was due to cancer. At that time, too, he was attending Ford Trade School where he could earn some money. I remember him buying me a great big candy axe for my 8th birthday, the last of my birthdays at which he was alive. It was in October 1930 that we moved to 5029 14th, near Warren, and it was in that January 1931 that Herman died. As I review the later part of Herman's life, he was only born in October 1914, I see an eager, happy, even with only one leg gone, jovial, lovable brother. I remember him bending over a table drawing plans and parts of motors. He died at the age of 16 with all his life before him. I believe it was because of anemia caused indirectly by cancer of the leg and its amputation. As I look back on that Sunday, January 4th, 1931, we had no suspicion that he was going to die that evening, and yet it happened. I remember seeing his body covered with earth amid the crying of my mother. Today he would have been about 25. But I leave this dismal and frightening subject and go on with the events in my life. On one side of us, I remember there lived a Marie and Rita, 2 little sisters, and on the other side for a while there was a Kenneth and his sister with whom we also sometimes played. We spent 5 years in that house. There we went to fresh air camp where we swam and played games, etc. In that house was where we played cops and robbers and saved Indian and baseball cards. I entered the 3A grade there at Hancock. I went through the 6A there, skipping the 6B, and then entered McMichael, where I went until a month before I graduated from that school. It was in this house that Frank came to live with us. He was tall, jovial, sometimes got drunk, worked hard, and was a nice man. On May 8, 1936, however, he succumbed at the house of his mother, Mrs. Poirier, to pneumonia. In the 7th grade at McMichael, I was elected to the Honor Society. Gaylord Stasiak and Thomas Farmer, who also went to Hancock, were my playmates at that time, with the former my locker partner in the 7th and 8th grades. In the 9th grade, Edward Zymonsky was my locker partner. At this period of my life, I was intent on becoming a banker. I played baseball occasionally in the alley, and thus time passed. It was on June 1st, 1936, that we moved to 2630 Vicksburg. There is a picture among my things of the people in the homeroom in which I was and in which Mrs. Gordon was the teacher. On June 19, 1936, I graduated from McMichael School from the 9th grade. I had taken a commercial course. My next step was Northwestern. Northwestern High School, days of study and afternoons of work at A&P, cleaning basements, studying business arithmetic, bookkeeping, typing, and shorthand. It soon became accounting with an unbearable haste to graduate. Friends were few and amusements variegated. All life was rounded off, and I was a clog in a great industrial machine, delivering packages with hopes of tips, smiling pleasantly to Mr. Thompson, the manager of A&P. Days of wasted time, effort and thought with little use of capacities. Moving again to 2673 Virginia Park. Dull, lifeless existence. A lull before a gathering storm with grave potentialities. January 1938, joining of AZA, Aleph Zadik Aleph of B'nai B'rith. First attempt of socialization, a little premature. Cal Goodman, the active communist, intelligent along certain lines. Starting a grain of doubt as to well-roundedness of situation. Current problem club, discussion of what was occurring. First acquaintance with Spanish Revolution, the awakening of interest in world events. February 1938, Mr. Rice, Scarab Ink Company, Agent Supply Company, mixing ink, mounting stencils, wrapping packages. Start at 30 cents an hour. Short, fat, full of humor, friendly, curiously liked, own business, developed, took 5 years. Sells mimeograph supplies all over the country to ministers. A summer of stuffing envelopes, ads for Mr. Rice to send to ministers, and reading. At last I'd found the pleasure of reading. I couldn't read fast enough. Decided not to graduate in January, but to take college courses and graduate in June. AZA continues ridiculously. September and school again. Working for Rice after school. AZA and thinking. Atomic theory and chemistry hold my attention. December, and AZA continues. First time I took a girl out. Unpleasant experience. Very discouraging. Arguments on thinking about religion, politics, and economics beginning. Grave doubts as to foundations, basic ideas. Big questions arising. Working still for Rice. January 1939. The seed spreads. I am now a senior. Plans to enter Wayne as a chemistry student. Seymour Fisher, Walter Pitts, and Calvin Goodman. Formation of a branch of the American Studies Union, ASU. Trouble with authorities. Current Problems Club flourishes. Not enough students rallied around over banner. Math now my strong point. Began to consider myself good at math. Summer, 1939. Fisher, Pitts, and chess. Chess, theory, and practice. Hours spent in learning chess and reading, more and more. Meanwhile, working for Rice and taking one course in summer school in order to enter college. Wanting more time for reading. Wayne and plunging into work, studying, working for Rice. Pitts went to Chicago on a scholarship. Skipped English 1. English 2, college algebra, favorite subjects. Desire to write and desire to become a mathematician. Dropped out of AZA, disliked quantitative analysis, and found out field of interest was more towards mathematics. Thoughts beginning to clear, so I thought. Seymour Fisher, close friend during this period. Cold, intellectual, conceited, exacting, curly hair, 5'8", 145 pounds. Summer 1940 and Marxism. Reading Marx and reading some more. Not enough time to read. Working for Rice, which took up much time. Used to argue Marx for long afternoons and nights with Seymour. Visited Belle Isle, about only contact with nature. Longing for beautiful scenery and for something vague, undefined, apart from society. School again in physics with Judkins. Didn't like and decided only thing left was mathematics. How foolish a desire. February 1941, and brought home at 3738 Northwestern. Terrifically puzzled by war and thought something was being faked somewhere. Mistrusted Churchill terrifically and wondered what was up. Summer 1941, and Freud intermingled with wonderment at how far Hitler would go. Thought Hitler would win and make peace with U.S. Still not enough chance to do reading. Fall 1941, and interest in physics comes out strong. Terribly shocked by Russia's terrible state. Feared her collapse and end to Russian communism. War with Japan had a strong disagreeable effect. Strong desire to get away from home for a while. Thoroughly discouraged with economic wars. 1942 and quantum mechanics really interested me. Wanted more of it. Thinking of going away to college. Rice expanded, and I finally left him to be replaced by full-time workers. Mounted stencils for Mr. Bacon. Was making 60 cents an hour for Mr. Rice. Made more from Mr. Bacon. Torn by a desire to write, express my feelings, and to lose myself in physics. Seymour had changed from a pre-medical course to majoring in social science and then landed in psychology. Decided to visit George Klein in Chicago. Also went around Detroit with Albert Crouch, interested in economics. Found Chicago plans so advantageous on visit, decided to risk all for a real change and go to Chicago. Chicago, June 1942. 5602 Maryland. Dark, stuffy room at $12 a month. Stayed a week and then moved with Seymour to a kitchenette at 5233 Cornell. Concentrated on physics, inasmuch as 3/4 of residence would give me my master's degree. Stayed a month there and found it was too far. Moved to 5466 Kenwood. Studies interesting. Not sure of myself. Thoroughly cynical and fed up. Moved to 5467 University, where we stayed 3 months. Zimmerberg, a mathematician, dull, uninteresting New Yorker. Friendly, but not very intellectual. Milton Edelman, tall and more intelligent. Wondering about a thesis. Typed for a man for an afternoon, bust at billing, and pinboy at Ida Noyes. Started working for Mr. Kutaxis, squaring the circle and duplicating the cube at $1 an hour. Went home for a week at the end of the quarter. Did not enjoy myself at all. Decided to work under Dr. Bentler in spectroscopy for my master's. Winter quarter and at last happiness. Working intensively on my thesis with Dr. Bentler. Meeting Manuel Schwartz and Howard Holzer. Going around with Klein and Fisher. Expected to take over Milton's job, but not called up by meteorology. Seymour enters reserves. I got a deferment for 6 months. Dr. Bentler from Germany, a great physicist and spectroscopist. Really a great advantage, especially with all the equipment available. 5'9", mustache, dark, friendly, and interesting to talk to. Began seeing physics as apart from society, cold, uninviting. But during the same time, through the dancing class, the greatest of all pleasurable things occurred. I met Joan Salmon. Joan, about my height, slim, very good-looking, extremely sociable, pleasant to talk to, excellent company, likes to walk, loves nature, interested in life, full of life, and notably kind, courteous. Played ping-pong first, very enjoyable time. Went together to see Mrs. Miniver. Walked home from show together. Maxwell Street with very unusual and splendid experiences. Walks after dancing class. It happened one night, benefit performance. A walk in the park feeding peacocks, pheasants, ducks, loons, squirrels, rabbits, and pigeons. Afterward, playing anagrams and eating supper at her house. Those were the most memorable and enjoyable times I ever spent. Attended gathering at Dr. Bentler's apartment. Drank 2.5 glasses of wine. Still work for Kutaxis, borrow money from home to pay for expenses. Lived temporarily with High and then moved to 6027 Woodlawn. Drifting into a period of self-satisfaction which I do not like. Continually I keep thinking of Joan. Dear Seymour, just now, lying in bed, I had considerable that I was going to say to you. That was why the single space. It was going to be a long letter. Now that I am sitting up writing, I find my reactions, ? Quite different. The question mark because I am finding verbal language puzzling, and especially words like that. I find nothing within or outside myself, but here too I am verbalizing something, and that too makes that meaningless. Apparently I am getting nowhere fast, and what I am driving at is that I find that I am using language and accepting certain reactions, and upon analysis there is no basis seemingly for doing either. Hence I say there is nothing, but in so saying I am using these reactions, and I end up in something or other. First there is a void, then, in using certain words and certain reactions, there is no longer the same thing, but something else. The conclusion, nothing is anything or something. Anyhow, it is all quite ridiculous. I do use something, which I call talking, so now I take for granted a number of things, but my statements are meaningless, my actions are meaningless, and meaningless is meaningless, so I get nowhere fast. Hence, I might decide that there is no point in trying to reason, but that decision has as little meaning as anything else, so apparently there is no decision. I arise about 8 every morning. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what you are. I'm not sure what stimulate is, but apparently when you read this letter, you will be stimulated in some way by that statement, which does seem to have some external meaning. Meaningless. I work all day and the work is absorbing, which means that my attention is focused to a more or less degree on the work and to a less degree on reflections. I return to the apartment for lunch and supper and prepare most of my own meals. I bake cakes. I baked one earlier this evening. I cook pot roasts, steaks, etc. Don't get the idea from the above that I spend a lot of time in introspection. On the contrary, I force myself to focus my attention on particulars, particularly all the time. But since everything is seemingly quite arbitrary, again I am aware that all I write is meaningless, including this statement, which it doesn't make a great deal of difference if I would spend time on such reflections. When your V letter came, I was acting as director of a Film Institute program. You are aware of how I accidentally, became attached to the documentary film group? Well, that interest has widened and became involved with other goals, which I hope will eventually come out in this letter. As I was saying, I arranged and put on 3 Russian films as examples of the works of 3 Russian directors. Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky, Pudovkin's Mother, and Dovzhensko's Shore. Incidentally, the second one had the most effect on me, more so than nearly any other film I had seen, and then most books I have read. That meant previewing one night and showing one night. The same was also true for the documentary and fiction films. That took 4 nights a week. Then I undertook to mimeograph 15 pages of film notes in the 3 films. I stayed up all night, 4 nights during that period. At the beginning of the year, the Labor Rights Society was formed. A number of people around campus, including the Wolfensteins, formed an organization designed to find out about the troubles of labor unions and to help wherever possible in whatever way they could. I arbitrarily have decided on a certain mode of action for the next few years, which such a society fitted in very well with. Also, I bought a movie camera and projector, and the documentary film group is buying a sound recorder, so I've decided to practice the use of the equipment and techniques in making a movie in conjunction with the union on their activities and troubles. The society takes up a certain amount of time and at least 1 night a week. The movie takes up some time. I still visit the Wolfensteins, Berger, and have primary contacts with half a dozen other people. People have always been rather hard for me to describe, so I won't attempt that. Also, I've taken to writing again, and still persist in doing a certain amount of reading, and every once in a while I study a few languages. For the most part now I live in the present. The past, though I seem to remember much quite well, seems to be quite meaningless. I seem to be reacting in the present, and I don't know what that means. Although I make general plans for the future, I don't know anything about that. You are part of the past. Our relationship was such that you had such an effect on me, and I became so adjusted, to you, that you are still part of the present, in that I think and wonder about you often and still feel very much attached to you. Yet immediate reactions seem to take such precedence in thought and deed that I am negligent in writing to you. And when I think of how I am changing, not necessarily basically or in character, although possibly, but mainly in activity engaged in or in immediate reactions, and when I think of how you are probably changing and become adapted to different modes of reaction and thought, I puzzle as to what would occur if we ever met again. Would we be strangers, or could we again have enough interests in common so that we could resume primary ? Relations? The question marks, I think, indicate that I am not sure of the usage or meaningfulness of the words, but that I am hoping that you get what I am driving at. Basically, I feel that this whole letter is meaningless, but some of the words might indicate feelings or emotions which might have meaning. At the present time, I am also very much interested in a girl. I find that she occupies much of my attention. That is, I focus much of my attention upon mental thoughts of her. So far, there has only been what I have chosen to define as mental intercourse, but my reactions, as I apparently seem to respond, have been such as I have never known before. Again, I have recourse to the meaningless of the whole business, and even when I do, I still find myself feeling and reacting to her, which penetrate and make impossible that escape or rationalization method I have set up to supposedly handle every situation. Not that it won't do for all mental and social reactions, but I see that my drives and certain emotions will have to coexist alongside of it. Luckily, my attempted verbal descriptions of what I am doing or feeling is meaningless. Nevertheless, to myself, I seem aware of certain things which I inwardly am willing to recognize, so outwardly they are as meaningless as everything else. From this letter, you can see that I think and act in certain ways. As this letter only took about an hour or an hour and a half to write, it cannot anywhere nearly adequately describe my reactions or deeds since last I saw you, or even since last I wrote you. For some reason, I felt like giving my responses as they have been occurring to me. If you don't care for such a nonsensical response, say so, and even if it does mean inhibiting certain verbalizations, I can write principally on activity and people, presuming I do answer the next letter you presumably write, which both, I hope, is the case. I am sorry I have not yet had the home study booklet sent to you. I will try to do so in the immediate future. Joe is still at Fort Sheridan and comes down occasionally. May joined the Wayses and after 5 weeks basic at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, expects to be stationed at Fort Sheridan. I have not seen the Zimmerbergs for 2 to 3 months. Holzer married Mary and left her in Chicago when he went back to California, and now occasionally neglects to write to her. I seldom see Manuel Schwartz. Charlotte said to send you her regards. Lincoln takes his physical exam in the next couple of weeks. Berger is 1A and gives himself less than 6 weeks. Ephraim is 1A but is still loose. Remenchik is an ensign and is studying radar. Joan, the girl I proposed to, now lives at the co-op that the girl I mentioned before, Dottie by name, lives at, and incidentally they are both hitchhiking to Ann Arbor this weekend, as it is in between quarters. I keep thinking of the Jabberwocky, which is another one of my escape devices. So at this point, I will close, hoping that you don't get killed or maimed in the forthcoming action next 6 weeks. Norman. Does he expect me to join that union? I ain't no communist, Red. I make enough to live on, and someday I might be boss. Hell, unions only cause dissent among the workers, and fighting, and riots, and police intervention. Don't the people know when they got enough?
Workers of the world, unite. You are the strength of the nation. Make the nation strong. Take over what is rightfully yours. Stop once and for all capitalist exploitations.
What fools listen to them soaking in this rubbish. I shouldn't worry. I make a living out of it, and at the same time get my revenge. I can't get anywhere under the system, so I may as well cause it trouble. Who knows? Maybe someday the people will get wise and revolt.
Christ died for you. He died so that you might live. It is for you to choose. Accept Christ as your Savior and live eternal peace. Reject Christ and live in eternal damnation. We have amongst us a lad who recently saw the error of his way and is ready to accept Christ as his Savior. Step up and tell us how God made his presence known to you.
Oh, Master, are you not well? I feel a mood coming on in, which I have to tell what I feel. What is the use, Master? I do not know. I must talk.
We must not act yet. We must wait. Germany is expanding. She is a menace to the United States. England, she is decaying. We have nothing to fear. Japan is expanding. She is a menace to the United States. Russia is expanding. Russia is a menace to the United States. But Germany is expanding faster. Germany is the bigger menace. Support Russia against Germany. When Germany, Russia, England, Japan, Italy are all weak, we shall step in to help out. America will lead the world. Are you not proud, citizens? America will dictate to the world. American culture will spread. American methods will prevail. Then will be the time to take over South America. Then we can curb American labor. It is split now and in such condition helpless. Hitler is the symbol under which we can unite the people to fight for us. And if that is not enough, we can start on the Negro. America's time is coming. Get ready to fight Hitler. We shall tell you when.
I'll show him. I'm not going to take nothing from no one. Here he comes now. When he comes by this corner, I'll have it out with him. It's all his fault I ran over that child. He was the one who told me to drive faster. Why should I take all the blame?
Don't eat anything unless it is a health food. It is the food that makes us a nation of weaklings, not enough vitamins. Now our liquid food contains all the essentials. This is entirely scientific. Dr. CDGFZ is our authority, and he has had 500 years of training. He says 20 minutes of health food makes you as strong as an ox. Try it now. After today's speech, I should take in another $20,000. We certainly have a country full of intelligent people.
O master, why continue? I must. It is the people who fight the wars. It is the people who are the slaves. It is the people who know it all, and the hard part is that we are part of the people.
Just think, fellow stockholders, under this system there would be no labor troubles. You would get all the profit you needed and the people would have their symbols. It works perfectly. Look at Germany. With a small, well-trained group of, shall I say, fools, our chosen leader makes sure it continues to work. Now is the time to prepare for what is sure to come.
I no longer go to shows or listen to the radio or read the newspapers. That is taking part in an activity which is not truly Christian. Now I follow Christ's teachings and associate only with those who believe the same as I do. That is what Christ wished. I do not do wicked things and keep from having wicked thoughts. I try to emulate Christ. That is the least I can do. He died for the people. I have accepted Christ as my Savior. Worldly things no longer concern me.
Marx has shown us the results of capitalistic exploitation. Lenin has shown you the results of capitalistic imperialism. Will you not heed what they have proved? Can you not realize your own strength? Russia has shown the way. She cannot stand alone. For communism to be effective, it must be worldwide. There is still hope. Do not hesitate. Workers of the world, unite.
Oh, master, it is useless, I know. But what difference does it make? After all, the only purpose of man is to reproduce, to keep his own race surviving. And if man is not supreme, perhaps the insect will be. To reproduce, man certainly hides and suppresses the most fundamental purpose.
Democracy works. We see it work in the United States. Nobody starves in the United States. We are one big happy family. We elect our own representatives to rule us. Our country is leading the world. There is opportunity for all to rise to the top. All races and all creeds live together in this melting pot of happy and free. We can sing for joy and be proud to live in America and be Americans.
Let me see, what else can I buy? I have 50 suits of clothes, 20 automobiles, 10 airplanes, 30 houses, 3 senators. I shall start a research foundation to perpetuate my name. Why didn't I think of that before?
And our toenail polish will make you alluring. You'll be more desirable than ever before. You will be popular. You can look the world in the face and say, I used the correct shade of toenail polish. You will have boyfriends galore. And our toenail polish is cheap. Yes, I said cheap. It costs a negative 1/16 of a cent. Isn't that cheap? For a negative 1/16 of a cent, you will be the hit of the party.
Oh, master, why do you not commit suicide? I know I should, but it's amusing to watch the people kick around what they alone can accomplish. I find enjoyment in reading what they have to say, and I do not particularly enjoy the thought of death. Being a member of the human race, I should carry out the purpose for which I was intended, regardless of the hopelessness of the situation.
Now listen to me, men. The United States has picked you to defend its shores. A nation is counting on you. 2 years and a half is not such a long time. If we go to war, you will be heroes if you live and martyrs if you die. And when we release you from the army, you can go back and raise another crop of soldiers to defend the United States. You have no cause to grumble. The United States gave you a home, parents, good food, good education. Now you can do something for the United States. I shall give each of you a flag which you are never to give up. You are to eat with it before you sleep with it under your pillow. Think of it the whole day. It is your share of the United States. Now we shall train you.
Oh, master, why do you not write your thoughts? What good is it to write? Very few ever read a book which makes them think, perhaps 1 out of 1,000. What good does that do? Always the people think only of themselves. Their children learn the same way. The process is continuous. If all babies were taken from their mothers at birth and brought up scientifically and socially minded, but who is to judge what is the best way to educate them? Besides, what mother would consent to such an arrangement? Why do I have such thoughts? What good does it do to think about it?
There is no God. There never was a God. It is all a plot to hoodwink you into acceptance of your present condition. Do not be misled. Wake up to the facts.
Day in and day out, one day after another, 1 hour after another, 1 year after another, 1 decade after another, 1 minute after another, 1 second after another. Continuously, except when I'm laid off, I have to push that button. I can never rest. I just push that button 1 day after another, 1 week after another. I just push that button, and then out of it, the assembly line, it comes completed. I have contributed by pushing that button.
You have risen from the ranks and made good. What is your success story? How have you done it? 130 million Americans would like to know. Tell us the formula so that we can all be successes and make good. If you can do it, we can do it. You just tell us how.
Sleep in dirt, eat in dirt, play in dirt, work in dirt. Sure, that is what I do because I am a migrant worker. I live that way and I love it that way. I wouldn't have it any other way. Somebody has to do that type of job and I may as well do it. I have no other choice. My co-workers accept it and so must I. United, we might be able to improve our condition, but we haven't got the sense to unite. And we will damn quick throw out anybody who tries to organize us, the dirty communist. Why doesn't he go back to Russia where he belongs? We don't want him here.
Sure, the Negro deserves every equality. He has every right that we have, but he can't eat our food. He can't live in our neighborhood. He can't go to the same show we do. He can't go on the same trains we go. He can't do what we do. But he has every right. He too is an American. If he breaks our laws, we will give it to him good. He is condemned before he acts. But he has rights. Sure he has.
Oh, are you an Indian? I thought they sold us America and left. You are a vanquished race. This is our country. You are a foreigner. America for the Americans. You were here first? Yes, I guess you were. But you had no right here. This was our country. America is ours. Amscray.
America has a past. We won every war we ever fought in. We are strong. We are powerful. It is our duty to lead the world. We shall permit every country to use our form of government, for it is the only form of government that people want. All have equal opportunity. One can start from the bottom and reach the top. Let us say a prayer. O God in heaven, we thank you for bestowing on us a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We thank you for such leaders as Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, Franklin, Webster, Lincoln, etc., for they all helped to make America. Amen.
A home run, a touchdown, a knockout, a strike, a ringer, a basket, a goal. We can all play and take part. I like to score some points too. Won't you let me? Sure, join in the game. It's all in fun. While you play, you can forget your day's work. You can think you are happy and have always been. Happy until tomorrow morning when you go to work again. If you get tired, just think of the night when you can play and be happy again.
If you vote for me, I will gladly use your taxes for my own enjoyment. It will make me only too happy. You elect me and I'll take your money. Is that fair? I knew you would agree. Now we all are happy. I am glad to be the people's choice. It means so much to me, or should I say, for me.
The ship has been hit by a torpedo. It is sinking. Why don't they do something? Help, help. I'm going to die. I'm going to drown. I don't want to die. Save me, somebody. Why doesn't somebody do something? Oh God, don't let me die. I beseech thee to be merciful and spare my life. Help!
We are part of the middle class. We own our home. We have our own car. We are satisfied with the United States. We know it is not all honey, but we get along. We want it this way, and we are in the majority. Therefore, don't try anything unless you are looking for trouble. We will let the workers organize our way, the American way. If you are not satisfied, get out of the country. Go to Russia or to Germany. We want it this way here.
I wish I could do something, but there is nothing. When I try to help the workers, they put me in jail. When I stabbed that policeman for clubbing my wife, they really got after me. Now I stand here, a rope around my neck, a rock under my feet, and an angry mob milling about. And now they are pushing the rock from under my feet.
Workers of the world, unite! That is the biggest farce of all.
June 22nd, 1944. A parody on a letter from a certain brother. Time wasted to write, time wasted to read. The moral is, do not read, do not write. No, the moral is you're a damn fool. Dear Norman, she starts out in the same old way. You think no use to read further, but you do read further. Why do you read further? Why do you read? But this is nonsense. If it is nonsense, then it doesn't make sense. But it does make sense. There are 3 buts in this paragraph. That means I must start a new paragraph. You left us at the station. and we went through a little gate. We walked for miles down endless tracks. We found our train. We hurried to the empty seats. We sat down. We waited for the train to start. The train was 45 minutes late. 45 minutes of precious time lost forever. Someday I shall find that 45 minutes, but not today. Today I haven't time to look for them. Tomorrow? Perhaps. Yes, I shall look for them tomorrow. You ask yourself, is life worthwhile? You cannot find an answer. The people got on the train. One by one they straggled along. Soldiers and sailors, civilians too, all wanting to come to Detroit. We left behind us the great and lonely city, and we turned our faces towards a new dawn. He concluded the whole mess did not make sense. We roared through the night with the Motor City Special behind us, but how could it be behind us? Was in fact nonsense and continued to play. We arrived in Detroit on the dot at 8 o'clock or thereabouts and picked up our suitcases. We took a taxi home, sharing it with a woman and her little girl. Our suitcase kept bumping against the little girl's knees. Four-handed bridge with a two-legged table, which... We opened the door and went in. Nothing had changed. The home is as ever. What should change? We went back to work the next day. The work had piled up. I took dictation all day. I will transcribe it tomorrow. Life is a dream from which we wake. Life is a dream. My life is as ever. My work is the same. The Shepherds visited us tonight. I hear their voices in the next room. Little Amy May is asking me a question. I shrug and ignore it. Chicago, where they do such things. And they say such things in... This is the way my life will continue now until the end. Someday there must be an end. His spirit gone, his mind a wreck. He lost all hope for man. He learned too late the bitter truth that man didn't give a damn. Jeanette thought the poem good when I showed it to her. Your brother is brilliant. He is living, she said. He is living. We are just existing. What more can one say? Had been following him all day. My first memory of anything political was my chanting as a 10-year-old on the playground of an elementary school. 1, 2, 3, 4. Who are we for? Roosevelt, Roosevelt, rah, rah, rah. 12 years later, FDR was running for a fourth term and was to give a speech at Soldiers Field in Chicago. I was one of over 100,000 people who went to hear him speak. I was into 16mm photography at the time. When a roar in the crowd announced FDR's arrival, I looked in vain for his entourage. I saw faintly in the distance some cars pull up to the central grandstand. I doubted if anything would show up on the film, and thus ended my first participation in a political rally. I first tried ice skating in Detroit on a flooded field. It was one of the few sports we could engage in during the Depression. I continued to ice skate occasionally after I went to Chicago. One day, when I was working for the Manhattan Project, I heard that Enrico Fermi often ice skated under the West Stands. The area was flooded during the winter, and it might be my only chance to see the physicist. Fermi was the person who developed the nuclear reactor. I did go one afternoon and did see Fermi skating with several of his co-workers. In 1942, Argonne National Laboratory was established in the outskirts of Chicago, and the test reactor was moved to the safer location. In 1945, I had the opportunity to perform neutron experiments using the reactor. Fermi returned to the University of Chicago after the war to teach and do research at Argonne National Laboratory. The Geiger counter he used during his early experiments was named after Winnie the Pooh characters. I was using them in my experiments and later shared them with Fermi. Instrument of destruction, insignificant, potent neutrons, born of the brain of the scientist, critical mass, calculated and computed carefully, built by the brawn of the industrialist, sensitive mechanism, time to perfection, assembled by the art of the technician, small object, deadly and destructive, carried by the conquerors of the air. You and I, working and playing, laughing and crying, fighting a war that we hate and despise. We hear the noise, wonder what it was, and from then on, we are dead. Alpha rays, beta rays, and gamma rays flit merrily over the land. That once was noisy with living, and now contains only the dead. I can think of 3 gifts which bring back memories. 2 of them date back to 1946, when I was working for the Manhattan District. At the time, I was acquainted with 2 pre-med women students, one of which gave me a copy of The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry for my 21st birthday. She later became a psychotherapist in Boston. The second pre-med student was from Israel and was also a gifted painter. She did a 14 by 20 portrait for me of the dog I had at the time. It is one of my most cherished possessions, and I have it hanging in our bedroom. When Lewis Carroll wrote The Hunting of the Snark, he said it grew in a sort of backwards fashion from a single line, the last line, for the snark was a boojum, you see. In Fit the Third, The Baker's Tale, he wrote, "But, O beamish nephew, beware of the day, if your snark be a boojum, for then you will softly and suddenly vanish away and never be met with again." That is the origin of Boojum's name. For my vacation in the summer of 1946, I decided on a solo bicycle ride around Lake Michigan with Boojum as a passenger in the basket. Included in the itinerary was a canoe trip in Lake of the Woods National Park and Quetico Provincial Park, all settled into a routine until we camped in northern Minnesota. Most of the areas we were passing through consisted of farms, and we found sleeping places back from the roads. This was just post-war, and there was very little auto traffic. When I woke up, Boojum was gone. I was afraid he had gotten himself lost and decided to abandon him to the farmers, but before I broke camp, he returned. I concluded he had had a night with the local female dogs. He made an excellent canoeing partner, but was of no help during the portages. Boojum had freedom to roam the streets of South Chicago. I left him with the owner of a bicycle shop when I was gone weekends. One day in March of 1947, when I came to get him, the shop owner said Boojum had ingested some poison and had died. He was buried under a tree in front of the shop. His lifespan was barely 2 years. "Just the place for a launching," the assembly cried, as they backed the trailer with care, supporting the boat on top of the tide with long ropes entwined with their hair. "Just the place for a launching. I have said it twice. That alone should encourage the crew. Just the place for a launching. I have said it thrice. What I tell you 3 times is true." The crew was complete. It included a car, a medic, a doctor, and physicists too, a baby, a wife, the whole of the spar, and a purple cow that knew how to moo. The Snark was a 22-foot cabin boat, perfect for cruising on Lake Michigan. It had a retractable keel, which was useful for shallow water. I kept it harbored in the downtown Chicago marina. One fine Saturday morning, I decided to sail to the Indiana sand dunes for the weekend. The sun was shining bright by the time I was out of sight of Chicago, and I was enjoying the balmy weather and the smooth sailing. Then the squall hit. I had never been in anything like that before. The waves kept coming. The boat was tossed about like a wild kid on a trampoline. To top it off, I got seasick. It was horrible. I was ready to die. The boat didn't matter, and I could care less. Hours seemed to pass with no end in sight. Somehow the squall subsided and the sand dunes were visible. The boat had been blown south at a rapid rate. After I beached the boat, I lay quivering on the beach until I recovered from my seasickness. I couldn't believe what had happened. The next day I sailed back to Chicago. The weather was excellent, but I kept the shoreline in sight the whole way. I had been thinking about sailing across Lake Michigan to the Michigan side, but now I had second thoughts about that. Within the year, during the winter storms, the Snark was blown from its mooring in the Chicago harbor, and was wrecked beyond repair on Chicago's waterfront. The next boat, Snark II, was a racing class boat, a Comet. The only time I had a nickname was when I was on a ranch in Montana. I was hitchhiking to Berkeley to pick up my old car that I had loaned to two fellow co-opers to drive there earlier that summer. I met another hitchhiker on the way, and we were both picked up by a rancher outside of Billings and accepted his offer to work for a couple of weeks for room and board. I ended up milking the cow, feeding the pigs and chickens, hauling water, and other odd jobs that needed doing on the ranch. I was called Shorty. The following year, 1947, I had 6 weeks available before summer school at the University of Mexico started in Mexico City, so I decided to visit the ranch again. I was still Shorty, of course. It was fun for a while, but not for a lifetime. I met my brother Joe at the bottom of the Grand Canyon on the way to Mexico City. In the summer of 1947, I was unsure of what I wanted to do. I enrolled in the summer session at the University of Mexico in Mexico City. 2 other students and I met with an anthropologist from Tulane University who suggested a visit to recently discovered Mayan ruins on the Usumacinta River in the jungle of Chiapas. We thought we could take a dugout canoe from near the head of the river, but the craft got stuck in a rapids just below our starting point. So we hired a Chiquiros plane to fly us to a landing strip where we hired a guide to take us to a hut where the Indians knew the temple. The Indian guide led us to the temple and said not to disturb the gods before he left us. That night we camped near the river. The river, I erroneously thought, formed the border to Guatemala. As I had hoped to visit Guatemala later that summer, I decided to visit it then. I stripped and jumped into the river. The current was more than I realized, and I was carried well down the river. I finally reached the other shore, but the jungle was too thick to reach solid ground. I came to the conclusion that my best choice was to swim back to the shore I started from. But again, the jungle was too thick. I wiggled my way through to the trail that I hoped had followed the river from our camp, expecting at any moment to meet one of the jaguars we had heard earlier. Somehow I reached the trail, and barefoot and nude, I walked back to the camp. My 2 friends were surprised to see me and said the last they saw was a head rapidly receding in the distance and assumed I would end up in the Gulf of Mexico. They had divided up my possessions. We made our way back without further mishap. When we arrived at the hut, they invited us to eat with them. Cooking on an open fire was the head, arms, and legs of a monkey. It looked just like those of a small child. We were past the leg. I pretended to take a bite. After seeing the Mayan ruins, we spent another night at the Caribay hut. This time there was an armadillo cooking. We declined the dinner offer and ate our own food. We may have eaten stranger food later in life, but at least we didn't know its origin. In the summer of 1950, I was on my way to California. I had finished my probational year at the Bureau of Standards and was not rehired. While in the District of Columbia, I had joined the Washington chapter of the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, and it was with them that I started the climbing spree. It began with 2 weeks in the Wind River Range, the range that forms the eastern boundary of Jackson Hole in Wyoming. We climbed about a half a dozen peaks in the range. 3 of us from the D.C. Rock Climbers and a professor from the University of Missouri decided to attempt a first ascent of Neptune in the Selkirk Range in British Columbia. We met at Lake Kimbasket and spent the next 2 days fighting the 3.5 miles of steep slide alder to the glacier. The mosquitoes were almost as awful, but it was a successful first ascent. Then I drove to Jackson Hole to climb in the Teton Range with the Philadelphia chapter of the PATC. There we climbed the Grand and Middle Teton, as well as some additional peaks in the range. I arrived in Berkeley in late August in time for a trip with the Sierra Club rock climbers over the Labor Day weekend. It was in the Minarets by Lake Ediza, and I was surprised to see one of the members carrying a week-old baby along with her. The weekend after that, my brother and I decided to do the lowest peak in the U.S. to the highest in the contiguous states, so we drove to Badwater, minus 282 feet, camped there, and climbed Mount Whitney the next morning. plus 14,494 feet. On the way back to Berkeley, we stopped off to visit the Palisades out of Bishop. That ended my summer of mountain climbing. My brother Joe and I were in good physical shape in September 1950, he after a summer of hiking and I after a summer of mountain climbing. So we decided to camp at Badwater, the lowest point in the Western Hemisphere, and dash up to Mount Whitney by noon the next day. We managed that without any problem, and we still had a couple of days left before we had to return to Berkeley. We decided to go on over Bishop Pass into the Palisade Basin because I was determined to climb the North Palisade Peak. I took off in the morning, leaving Joe to hike around. As I was traversing the ridge, the climbing became more difficult. I found myself on a narrow arête with a steep fall on either side and stuck where I was unable to go up or down. I agonized for the longest time on what to do. I vaguely remembered a ledge on far below the place where I was stuck. I wished I had a rappel rope. Finally, I let go and dropped to the ledge a few feet below where I was stuck. I hurried back to where Joe and I were camped, but it was almost dark by the time I got there. There was a note from Joe saying that he had gone to Bishop to get the rangers to search for me, and if I was all right, to meet him at the top of the pass before 8 o'clock the next morning. I met him at the pass the next morning. He told me the ranger said that a person has to be missing overnight before they send out a search party. When I got back to Berkeley, I bought a 100-foot, 3/8-inch diameter emergency nylon rappel rope. I carried it the next summer when I hiked the John Muir trails. After successfully traversing the Sierra Range from Giant Forest to Mount Whitney, a group of us decided to do the John Muir Trail the following January. I was planning on hiking the whole trail that summer and could put food caches in at selected locations: Red's Meadow, Palisades Meadow, and Onion Valley. The food was sealed in 5-gallon cans, one of which was sent to Independence, the gateway to Onion Valley. Also, I was having my mail forwarded to Independence. It was a magnificent hike and a great way to spend a summer. The weather was perfect, except for one afternoon of showers. I did one of the passes by moonlight and walked over 30 miles that day. When I reached Onion Valley, I left my camp that day near Onion Lake and hiked over Kearsarge Pass to pick up the third cache and to get my mail. It was disastrous. One piece said that the job I was applying for was not available. I applied 10 years later and was hired. The second letter said I was refused entry to the University of California at Berkeley. I decided to return immediately to Berkeley to plead my case. I hurriedly returned to Onion Valley to place the cache and collect my camping equipment and returned to Berkeley. I returned as quickly as I could and gave up doing Forester's Pass and Mount Whitney portion of the Muir Trail. I convinced the chairman of the Geophysics Graduate School that I was a capable student, and he had me admitted as a student. It was the 2 years I spent there that qualified me as a research worker on the Arctic Ocean. About 15 years later, I took the family over Kearsarge Pass and Forester Pass and up Mount Whitney so I could say I hiked the whole trail. I mentioned last week that hiking the John Muir Trail was a pleasant experience, but for one horrendous detour. I saw from my map I was nearing a junction through the Enchanted Gorge. The name captivated me and made me wonder what was so enchanting about it. At the head of the canyon were two minor peaks named Scylla and Charybdis. That alone should have made me suspicious. They were two of the terrors that Ulysses faced on his long 20-year departure to the Trojan Wars. I didn't realize I was in for a horrible surprise. After hiking a short distance and dropping in elevation, I found myself in a boulder field which covered the bottom of the canyon. The water below the large boulders was gurgling away below the huge rocks, plentiful but unreachable. I had to walk gingerly from one massive boulder to the next down the canyon. If I misstepped anywhere, I don't think anyone would ever find me in that isolated place. I was thirsty and thought of all that water below me flowing by. To cut a long story short, I did finally reach the east-west trail through Sequoia National Park from the San Joaquin Valley to the John Muir Trail and was back on my magnificent hike of the trail. I resolved not to be taken in again by a fascinating-sounding name. I have a number of memories that I could talk about on flying. It could be the flight I took in 1946 in a two-seater plane near Chicago with my research supervisor, L.J. Hughes. Or the flight I took in 1962 in a glider with a woman I met on Bay Area Rapid Transit who owned it. Or it could be in the mid-90s in Phoenix in my niece's balloon. Or it could be flying over the equator on the way to Peru in 1986 in a commercial airliner. But it will be running out of gas in a cargo plane over the Greenland ice cap in March 1954. The Arctic Ocean freezes over time to an approximate depth of around 20 feet, with about 2 feet of it above sea level. Embedded in it are a few chunks of glacial ice which break off along the coast. Weather flights over the ocean had observed several of these, including Target 3, T3. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Fletcher was a pilot and trained meteorologist who started an observation post on the island which was free from breakups. Due to ocean currents and the wind, the ocean has a circular pattern of motion from the Bering Straits over the North Pole to Greenland and Ellesmere Island and Alaska, often shedding huge icebergs out between Greenland and Canada, as the Titanic found out. The ocean is full of ice ridges and open leads. I was on my way to do geophysical work on Fletcher Ice Island T3 for the Air Force Cambridge Research Center in March 1954 in a small cargo plane, a C-47, equipped with landing skis. The pilot decided not to refuel at Alert on the north coast of Ellesmere Island and to fly directly to T3. He was looking for a few black spots of buildings in a vast vista of whiteness, and even though he had the coordinates, he didn't find the island. He started back for the air base in Thule, but over the ice cap he had to land. The marine biologist and I decided to build igloos just in case we were marooned for a while. They didn't look like the ones we'd seen in pictures, but we had heard it wasn't wise to sleep in airplanes. By the time we were finished, we were rescued. While working in Boston for the Air Force Research Center, I made 3 trips to Fletcher's Island, T3. The first was in 1954. I was sent to Thule Air Force Base in January to wait the next flight to T3. The T3 refers to 3 targets the Air Force was monitoring in the Arctic Ocean. All 3 of them were floating ice floes which had probably broken off from glaciers in Ellesmere Island in northern Canada. When I arrived in Thule, it was 30 degrees below zero. It was March 25th before there was a flight to T3. During those 3 months, there were several times the wind blew so hard we were unable to leave our quarters. It was typical Arctic weather conditions. I was supposed to go to T3 for the summer, but the Air Force decided to abandon the island that spring. The Air Force contingent got used to throwing their garbage out the door during the cold nights. I decided to sleep in a tent nearby, which I found cozy enough that spring, and also decided on a 36-hour on and 12-hour off so I could coincide with every other meal with the rest. It worked out well during the rest of that stay. The island was evacuated on the 14th of May. My next tour to T3 was April 25th to September 24th, 1955. It was purely a research trip that summer with just 4 people. A geophysicist, myself, a marine biologist, a meteorologist, and an Air Force mechanic. We all had our work cut out. It turned out to be a pleasant summer. We all did our jobs. I was responsible for measuring our location and handled the radio communication with Thule. The last tour was for International Year in 1957. The island was reoccupied as USNC IGY Arctic Ocean Station B on March 7th. I stayed until June 6th. The people in charge decided the old camp area was unsuitable and laid out a runway to accommodate a larger plane to bring in living quarters for the scientists during IGY. These 3 trips were during the Arctic spring and summer, and conditions were usually around 32 degrees Fahrenheit and daylight all the time. In fact, I was able to sunbathe during the 1955 tour. I enjoyed the constant cold weather during my tours. Later, the ice island broke in 2 and drifted into the Atlantic Ocean. It was mid-January 1958. I had married Easter a week before when the knock came on the door. It was the head of the physics department of Chico State College. He had obtained my name from his counterpart at San Jose State College and decided to recruit me. I didn't want to leave Berkeley as my wife had contracted to teach until June in a first-grade Richmond school. I had been planning to study for a doctorate in geophysics during the spring term. But a job is a job, and I reluctantly accepted the teaching position offered and separated from my bride for the spring term, even though I spent most weekends back in Berkeley. That summer, we spent a belated extended honeymoon driving to the East Coast, visiting national parks on the way. The next summer, Easter joined me in Chico and gave birth in January to our first daughter. We knew we weren't going to stay in Chico, so the summer of 1959 I decided to try for a teaching credential for the 13th and 14th grade. All it required was one education and one audio-visual course. I took the 2 courses at Chico State Summer School, and all the rest of my time I spent in front of the room air conditioner in our living room. At the end of the 1960-61 school year, we were back in Berkeley. I never had to use the teaching certificate. Our first pediatrician was the wife of the physics professor who hired me to teach physics at Chico State College. She was great and delivered our first 2 daughters. Our second one came highly recommended in Berkeley after our return there. 6 months after we returned, our son was born. My wife and her mother were positive they were twins in the womb. This was prior to ultrasound, and the doctor insisted there was only one. Twins arrived 2 weeks early, but one of them only survived a short time, having a bad heart. Unfortunately, this was before heart transplants. The next daughter's birth was okay and on schedule. Before my wife's next pregnancy, the law that prohibited fathers from being in the delivery room changed, and I was planning on being there. Wouldn't you know it, it was a spontaneous delivery and started in a labor room. Our 5th child came 2 weeks prematurely, and I had no time to suit up. My wife had a bad backache following the delivery. The doctor insisted it was a mental problem, that nothing could be done about it. After a month of pain, she went to an orthopedist who diagnosed a slipped disc and said there wasn't any point in doing anything about it anymore, as she could tolerate the remaining pain. We moved to Berkeley in the summer of 1961 from Chico. I had taught physics there for the previous 2.5 years. The previous summer, I had spent most of my time in front of an air conditioner. We purchased a 40-year-old house in the Berkeley Hills and took over a low-interest GI loan. We had several immediate things to do. 1. Clear the jungle in the backyard of overgrown weeds and Scotch broom, the latter which my wife was allergic to. 2. Up the house electric voltage from 30 amps to 100 amps so as to avoid blowing fuses and to accommodate our electric dryer. 3. Change the hot water heater from a 30-gallon tank to a 50-gallon tank in order to avoid continually running out of hot water. I ended up taking 4 large trailer loads of weeds to the city dump. In 1965, we finished getting what we felt was necessary to make the house livable after modernizing the bathroom, putting in a deck and sliding door next to the dining room, and adding a parking place for a second car. We managed to live in the house without major further improvements for the next 40 years. By 2007, I had had it with the routine house and yard work and was ready to give up driving. We moved to an apartment in El Cerrito within walking distance of a shopping mall. The 80-year house was sold to a daughter and son-in-law and the car given to my son. Now they had a doubly old house. Among other things, they had to redo the electric work to make the outlets 3-prong, fix the foundation, repave the patio, which had resettled, and repair the deck. When we moved into our Berkeley house in 1961, I decided to plant some fruit trees. The Newton Pippin apple tree turned out to be especially prolific, giving lots of fruit, which lasted us for 4 months. We enjoyed lots of applesauce and apple pies. Easter would peel the apples, and I would core and section them. For the apple pie, I would roll out the dough and fit it into the 12-inch baking dish. I would feel the crust heaping high in the center. We liked the apples firm, and so we baked them for a minimum time. I'll never forget how much we enjoyed them. Our son especially liked them. Every fall, he was after us to make another one. Planting the apple tree was one of the better decisions I made. I had my apple a day for over a third the year for over 40 years. The cherry and plum tree didn't do as well. The birds got most of the cherries. The pear tree was so-so. Some years we got a few pears, but many of them were deformed. In the summer of 1961, we left Chico to live in Berkeley. We bought a house even though I didn't have a job in the area. My wife wanted to live in Berkeley. Though I knew I didn't want to be a TV repairman, I bought out a business. It was something to fall back on if nothing else turned up. I had meanwhile applied to the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory in San Francisco for a position. I had previously tried for one there 10 years earlier. I was lucky this time. The appointment came through. I happily gave up the TV business and gladly went to work in San Francisco. It was a dream come true. Unfortunately, the laboratory was disestablished in 1969. It took place along with the closing of many military bases for economic reasons. But it was a great job while it lasted. Fortunately, I had obtained a reputation in high-exposure radiation and found no difficulty getting another position. Those 8 years in San Francisco were the best in my career as a radiological physicist. My next job was for Physics International in San Leandro. My final job was for a radiation detection company in Sunnyvale. Both of these latter jobs were recommendations of my supervisor, Eugene Toshlin, at the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory. The rest of the family and I were car camping in the high country in Yosemite Park in the summer of 1966. We put our food in the station wagon at night. In those days, we could still drink water from streams flowing down from the melting snow. The two oldest girls were eager for an overnight bivouac higher up, so I decided to take them to a lake not far from Tioga Pass Road, but a couple miles from where we were camped. The next morning, the three of us drove to the parking lot, which was the starting point for our overnight backpack to the lake. We had a leisurely hike up to the lake. The girls were carrying their sleeping bags and I the rest of what we needed. The next day we drove back to the campground. Overnight, our camp had been visited by a bear and her cub. The food we had to leave in the tent had been taken by the bear, who had cut 3 sides of a rectangle into the side of the tent, where the box containing the food was. The bear pulled the flap forward and removed the box. My wife, not knowing there was a cub, chased after the bear. The bear dropped the box and only managed to hang on to a bag of marshmallows. The 3 younger children were unharmed. My wife was later able to sew up the flap the bear had made. That was our first experience with bears in Yosemite.
Fox jumped out in a hungry flight, said, "Oh man, moon, please give me some light. Many a mile to run tonight before I reach my den. Den-o, den-o. Many a mile to run tonight before I reach my den-o." Ran till he came to the farmer's yard, where the chicks and the ducks declared they heard. Their nerves will be shaken and their necks be wrung, and the little ones struck with the bones-o, bones-o, the bones-o. Nerves will be shaken and their necks be wrung, and the little ones struck with the bones-o. Grabbed the gray goose by the neck and he threw him up across his back. He didn't mind the quack, quack, quack of the legs all dangling down, no, down, no, down, oh no. Didn't mind the quack, quack, quack of the legs all dangling down, no. Now old Mother Slipper-Stopper jumped out of bed, and out of the window she popped her head. John, 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 the gray goose is gone, and the fox is off to his den, no, his den, no. John, 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 the gray goose is gone, and the fox is off to his den, no. Now John went up to the top of a hill, and he blew a blast both loud and shrill. Fox said, "That's very nice music, still I should rather be in my den, no, den, no, den, no." Fox said, "That's very nice music, still I should rather be in my den, no." Now he ran till he came to his own little den, with the dear little foxes, 8, 9, 10. They managed very well without knives and forks, and the little ones scrambled for the bones-o, bones-o, the bones-o. Managed very well without knives and forks, and the little ones scrambled for the bones-o.
redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. I've roamed and rambled, I've followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of Caribbean deserts, and all around me your voice is sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. The sun comes shining and I was strolling in the west clouds waving and the dust clouds rolling. The voice was chanting as the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling in the wheat fields waving and dust clouds rolling. The voice was chanting as the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Diane and John led us on a trip to China in 1980 when tourism there first opened. It was designated as a teaching study to look at schools. Our trip leaders arranged other trips in successive years, and in 1986 arranged a trip to the Silk Route. Easter had a long-term substitute job she didn't want to quit, so I went without her. It began with a few days in Beijing. On an off day, I decided to visit the Panda House at the zoo and walked there from the hotel. China was still undeveloped then and was very interesting. After visiting the pandas, I started walking back to the hotel. I soon realized I had taken a wrong turn and I had gotten lost in a city where I couldn't read the signs and I couldn't speak the language. I wandered aimlessly for the rest of the afternoon and somehow got to the Forbidden City, which I could recognize on the map and locate myself. I finally reached the hotel where part of our group was leaving for dinner, but I didn't feel like joining them and just wanted to sit and relax. The rest of the trip was great. We took the train to Urumqi. While passing through the desert, we saw the ruins of the oldest Great Wall. Outside of Urumqi, on the edge of the desert, we had a chance to try camel rides. We also visited a yurt in the middle of nowhere. Peru was our destination in 1986. My goals were the Machu Picchu Inca Trail and a high Andes pass. My brother and his wife accompanied Easter and me on the vacation. We flew to Lima and took a train to Arequipa. There we met up with our first llamas. A side trip took us to Colca Canyon, the deepest one in the world. While there, we saw the condors circling above. Puno and Lake Titicaca followed a couple of days later. A boat trip to a floating island was an unusual event. Every step a person took, one could feel water giving way below. Our next stop was Cusco and the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu. The trek was hard on Easter, especially on the last day when the guide went an extra distance before camping. She could barely climb the steps laid out by the Incas. It was well after dark before we reached the campsite. Then back to Lima for the tail end of our vacation. We took a bus to Cachapampa and the trailhead to the Cordillera Blanca Mountains and began our trek. We all did well on the ascent to the 15,660-foot pass, where we had a dusting of snow. The locals were very friendly to us as we walked by. It was a great ending to our Peruvian adventure. I am not sure if being a trekker is the same as being a tourist, but I sure felt like a tourist on this trek. In my 20s, I had a secret desire to climb Mount Everest. So when I saw the Wilderness Travel Catalog describing the Everest trek when I was 65 years old, I felt that I could at least go as far as base camp, which would be something. There were 10 of us on the trek. Flying Royal Nepal Airlines was an experience itself, which I won't go into. The first time I felt like a tourist was at the Summit Hotel in Kathmandu when the 10 of us sat in the lounge drinking beverages. Certainly I was a tourist wandering around the city, seeing the cows roam and the monkeys make free and visiting the many temples and markets. Of most interest was a cremation and a yogi going through various contortions. But the saddest part were the beggars and the maimed. I vowed never to go to India, where it was probably much worse. We finally flew to Lukla to meet our Sherpa crew and begin our trek. Lukla is where Hillary's wife and child were killed in a plane crash. Before the airstrip was built, it was a 2-week trip to and from Lukla through the jungles to begin a climb of Mount Everest. With all the catering of the Sherpas, I certainly felt like a tourist. Hiking through the Kumbha Valley and Sagarmatha National Park to base camp is an indescribable experience. When we neared base camp, we hiked up Kala Patar to get a magnificent view of the entire south face and most of the west ridge. Kala Patar is 18,187 feet high. The trek was one of the most memorable events of my life. In 2007, I decided I better not drive anymore. My reflexes seemed slower, and I mistrusted my handling of our 10-year-old Civic with about 22,000 miles. Also, I was getting behind in doing what had to be done and taking care of the house we had occupied for 46 years in Berkeley. So we moved to an apartment in El Cerrito. It was a 10-minute walk to the plaza, which had all the shopping needs we might require. The apartment was a 30-minute walk from San Francisco Bay with an amazing view of the Golden Gate and the Bay Bridge. There was also within walking distance a bakery shop, the library, and Albany Hill Park. Alas, the Bay and Bakery shop, along with Albany Hill, became too much for me to manage. So after 2 years, I gave up and decided to move to a retirement home and a new environment. One of our daughters located St. Paul's Manor on the web. Our oldest daughter, who lives in San Diego, was delighted, and she and her husband and 3 children came to El Cerrito, rented a truck, and drove us to St. Paul's and moved us in. 3 months later, they moved us to apartment 829. It was difficult for my wife and me to give up our house in Berkeley and the Bay Area, but getting older requires yielding to the inevitability of time and making the necessary changes.
We would hold a blanket from one another at night, and our mother had to buy us twin beds.
Oh, how old were you when that happened?
I can't remember. No way.
Maybe I'll look at the words. How's that?
Is that key all right?
Sure, it's fine.
Just read the words.
I gave my love a cherry that has no stone. I gave my love a chicken that has no bone. I gave my love a story that has no end. I gave my love a baby with no crying.
How can there be a cherry that has no stone? How